all of the things that bring us joy require two things. They require noticing and nurturing. And when I hear you talk about the sailing, and that's attention and effort, right? That somehow attention and effort need to be engaged. And so that's why scrolling on social media can often feel so bad, because we're not being attentive and it doesn't require any of our effort. We know deep in our gut that we're actually made for more. And that's why that sort of dull feeling we have, I think, happens when we're using technology in a really passive way.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Word Made Digital podcast. Thanks for checking out the video version of the podcast here on YouTube. Of course, we've got the audio version as well if you want to check that out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. But we really hope that these conversations week after week inspire you, connect with you, maybe stir something up in you or teach you something that you haven't heard before. We've got a whole archive of podcasts right here on the YouTube channel, as well as a ton of tutorials to equip you really practically as a communicator, as a leader in the church, and as a creative. So I encourage you to check that out. Subscribe if you haven't already. And thanks so much to the sponsors, Compassion Canada and the Church Go, for making this season of the podcast possible. Christina Crook, welcome to Word Made Digital. I'm really glad. It's about time I had you on this podcast.
Indeed. Thanks so much for having me.
We should start with an introduction. First of all, we are living in the same city, and through some Christian circles, we've had some connection. And because we have some nerdy interests that are the same to do with digital. But give us a bit of an introduction to who you are, and we'll dive in. I can't wait to have this conversation.
For sure. The simplest way to put it is that I'm a digital well-being expert. So I'm an author and a podcaster and a speaker. I speak about how to build a healthy relationship with the internet. So I've authored 2 books now. The first is The Joy of Missing Out, and the second is Good Burdens: How to Live Joyfully in the Digital Age.
Right. And I mean, then the obvious question is like, why? Because you were talking about this before it was trendy to talk about this. So can we go and like, what was disturbing your soul, or what was the research you were doing, or what you were observing in the world? Why did I mean, really, we're going back to the first book, but your work in this area with Joy of Missing Out, where did this come from for you?
Yeah, so I studied communication in university at Simon Fraser University. I'm originally from Vancouver. And I mean, I had a full education in being keyed into the ways in which technology shapes individuals and societies for the better or the worse. It's a liberal arts university. And so very much it was a critical lens on technology, asking those hard questions about, there's always a trade-off, right? For every new thing that we right on board, we are giving something else up, and sort of asking those hard questions about trade-offs. So that was sort of the framing I went into beginning my career, first at the CBC in Vancouver, then moving into freelance. And during that time, I moved from Vancouver to Toronto. And in one fell swoop, basically 95% of my relationships were somehow mediated now through the internet or through the phone, because I had moved so far away from, all of my lifelong relationships, and I was forging new ones. And so it was around that time that I started to use the internet in really new ways. And I wasn't really happy with the ways I was using it. It was much more passive. It was much more voyeuristic, sort of checking in on people's news feeds and the things they were posting to kind of get a glimpse of what they were doing in their lives. But knowing already at that point that I knew it wasn't the full picture, right? The pictures are pretty, but it's never the full picture. We all know this to be true. And then as a creative, I was was not very happy with my output. I was finding that I wasn't really, making big gains creatively, and there were practical reasons for that because I at that point had young kids. But I really knew that I was giving away a lot of time to the internet, and not good time. Let's say not time well spent. And so I decided to do something radical, which was to give up the internet for 31 days. And it was through that internet fast. It really
the whole
was
internet, not just social media.
No, the whole internet. So I had to file 2 stories during that month, like freelance pieces. I had to save them to a USB stick and mail them in an envelope to deliver on, like a lot of creative.
Yeah, you did.
A lot of creative workarounds. I have to say that filing pieces by email, big fan. It's cheap. It's free versus like the $40 to express an envelope, and then it got lost. It was a whole thing. So definitely it was an experiment in looking at the benefits and the detriments to my online habits. And what I discovered during that time was this incredible peace, like just a quietness of mind that I had been hungering for a long time. I just felt that things were quiet. And I started to realize that all those little 5-minute and 10-minute and 20-minute check-ins I made on my phone actually added up to a huge amount of time in a day. We always say we're so busy, I have no time. But actually all that little bit of margin, we're giving away that margin. And so all of a sudden having all that margin back allowed me to write and create and connect with neighbors. And so just full circle to answer your questions, that's where it all began for me. I wrote a number of essays about that experiment. My publisher reached out to me about expanding off of that into the book, which became The Joy of Missing Out. And then Jomo became a thing in the world. And so here we are today.
Wow. It's interesting you talk about trade-offs because with every new technology, there are trade-offs. Whatever we want to define as technology, like I think when any new technology, the light bulb, the iPhone, the train, when assembly lines, when any of these things came along as a technology or a new approach to how we fundamentally live in the world, we at first were always so optimistic. And it seems that it doesn't take long for most technologies to show its shadow. So can you speak to, I think some of the trade-offs maybe are obvious. You've already said, like, you can waste your time. But can you go a little deeper with us? Because I think we all know we're wasting our time. There's this Facebook, all the papers that have come out. It's all in the news these days. But what everybody already knew, which is that social media is bad for our mental health, and Facebook and all the other guys, they already know this. We all know this. But can you go a little deeper? What are some of those trade-offs that you're seeing with the internet?
So I like to get right down to the nitty-gritty. So instead of talking in big philosophical terms, I'd like to just get right into like a practical example. So an example would be Googling for the best pizza place versus asking someone, like your neighbor that you happen to bump into the street. Okay, so if you Google, it's right. The big promises of technology are convenience, right? It's going to be faster, better, easier. But actually, if we choose not to go for that convenience, to do something a little bit more inconvenient, like asking someone, or like you and I, even though we're not in the same space, I can ask you, Joanna, what is the best pizza place in Toronto? And you'll be like, let me tell you all about my favorite pizza place. And that is a moment, right? That is a moment for connection, right? That is a moment that we are seizing, and it is more inconvenient. Probably it's going to take us 5 minutes or 10 minutes instead of a nanosecond. But it's all of those decisions, all of those trade-offs that we're making on a daily basis. And so one of the studies that I share all of the time comes from a professor named Dr. Pamela Pavlisak, and she's a professor at Pratt. And she had people track their technology experiences in journals. And what she discovered through her study was that people that are happiest with technology use it in 3 very distinct ways. And they use it for creativity, community, and care. So care
Wow,
is
this is new. This is fascinating.
Yeah. And so when we talk about the trade-offs, the decision to, and so in the new book, I'm talking about, the big pushes, like I mentioned before, which are the, convenience and control, these pushes of big tech, and trading them for, actually, instead of choosing the convenient way, I'm going to choose the connecting way, the community way, instead of doing, whatever. I want to control my message or my, my persona on the internet. Actually, I'm going to give a little bit of that control up and just be more creative. I'm going to lean into creativity and be a little bit more bold and a little bit more myself. And so those are the trade-offs we're making on a daily basis.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay. Creativity, connection, care.
And care. Mm-hmm.
Those are the added values. And then there's some other stuff that starts to decrease, quality of life, etc. So there's this whole new book. There was obviously so much more to say, so much more research that you've done, so many more conversations that you've had and people you've had an opportunity to interact with. So, I guess tell us a little bit about this particular book, because I think some of my listeners will have read your other book or be familiar with your work. And why did you need the next book? Maybe in some ways that's an obvious question, but what is this talking about that the first one wasn't able to address?
So, good burdens. So right after you publish a book, people ask, what's the next book? And I was horrified by this question because it's like, no. Like, I'm not writing a book for a book's sake. Like, I have to be so taken with an idea, because it is honestly such a painful, laborious, economically viable choice to write a book. And so I had to be so captivated by an idea that I was going to give 2-3 years to writing and a book and putting it in the world. So Good Burdens is addressing the question that is posed by the philosopher Dr. Albert Borgman, which I hope many of your listeners are familiar with. And if they're not, please look him up, because he is a dear, beloved Andy Crouch.
Say the name again.
Dr. Albert Borgman. The least sexy name in the world. Albert Borgman, my dear friend, he is now probably 84. He is a professor emeritus at the University of Montana, a Christian, a deeply loved and respected thought leader. He, just for some context, Albert Borgman is the first person Andy Crouch, thanks in his book, The Tech Wise Family. Like, this is a person that is L.M. Sakassis, like all these people lean into Borgman. And so the question that
he's like the guy behind the guys.
He's the guy behind the guys.
Like, maybe some people you're naming that we would be more familiar with in more of a younger generation. He's the person informing their thinking.
Exactly.
So let's go to the source, people.
Let's go to the source, people. So in his 1984 book, Technology and the Shape of Contemporary Life, he asks a question. And the question is, what happens when technology begins to lift burdens we should not want to be rid of? And that is what Good Burdens is all about. That there are some burdensome things that we should not want to be rid of. So the burden of preparing a meal and gathering loved ones at the table, right? And sharing in conversation and being present in that experience. It is a burdensome thing to invite and to plan a menu and to cook, right? And to prepare. But Borgman's point is that once there's certain activities that once you're across a certain threshold of effort, the burden disappears. And we should want for those things. Those are good burdens.
This is a very beautiful concept to me. It makes me think of when we talk about spiritual disciplines, or spiritual practices. If people don't like the word disciplines, we talk about them as being good work, or maybe even a good burden is another way we could say it. And I compare it often to sailing, where like sailing is a hobby, but it's a beautiful, wonderful to catch the wind and go for a sail. If people have ever been in a sailboat, or you can imagine how that might feel to be pushed by wind. However, it's so much work to sail and to prepare the boat, and even when you're sailing, it's not a motorboat that you're just cruising along. You're constantly, checking the ropes, moving, adjusting the whole way. But it's this like good work. And so this good burden is fascinating.
I love that example because I actually use the metaphor of a ship in the book, but I actually now wish, thank you, Joanna, that I'd use, because I talk mostly about like an ocean liner. And the reason why I chose it, because I'm talking about capacity and I'm talking about, choosing what we bring aboard and keeping course. But what I like about what you're saying with sailing is there's an attentiveness that you need to have when you're sailing that you wouldn't need necessarily. Well, you probably do aboard a large ocean liner. And that comes to a point about joy. Part of the reason why I also wrote this new book, Good Burdens, was because I made this discovery, and it was actually by interviewing the mother of mindfulness, Dr. Ellen Langer, who was the first woman tenured professor in the psychology department of Harvard University, literally wrote the book Mindfulness 25 years ago and sort of popularized the study and interest in mindfulness.
Before you could buy the mindfulness candle at your local bookstore.
Indeed. But it was through talking to her about mindfulness that I made the connection that all of the things that bring us joy require two things. They require noticing and nurturing. And when I hear you talk about the sailing, and that's attention and effort, right? That somehow attention and effort need to be engaged. And so that's why scrolling on social media can often feel so bad, because we're not being attentive, and it doesn't require any of our effort. We know deep in our gut that we're actually made for more. And that's why that sort of dull feeling we have, I think, happens when we're using technology in a really passive way.
Yeah, well, and we know enough now to understand how it's chemically working like any other drug.
Exactly.
It's giving you the interaction, the comment gives you this quick hit, and then it dissipates, so you're seeking the next hit. But it's not actually rewarding you.
It's not lasting. That's right.
Yeah. Oh, this is very interesting. I mean, then this leads you on this whole journey. The work of your life now is you're going around talking about, not just talking about this, but even leading through workshops and I want to talk about this area of your life. But before we go there, you said something interesting right before we started recording, and I asked you, should we talk like you're a Christian or talk like you're not, just you're a person in the world? And you said that you'd like to out yourself a little more these days because your work isn't actually overtly, it's not a Christian work, it's regular work, whatever that, or secular work. I don't know if that's the word I like to use, but you want to out yourself a little more these days as a person of faith. So let's talk about that, because a lot of people listening to this podcast are Christian people who work in the regular world. They're not in church world. And I think it'd be a real encouragement, and just some insight from you would probably really be helpful about what are you trying to do with this?
Thank you for asking that question. I think so. I've never felt called to be a Christian writer. I've felt called to be a Christian who writes. And I just knew that was my mandate. I just knew that was what God had called me to do. And so I think in many ways I've chosen the more difficult path in the sense of trying to wrestle concepts and ideas to the ground so all people can understand, not using sort of Christian shortcuts to capture a large idea in a short amount of time. And I think, and I'm incredibly grateful that I've done that work, and I've only done it because, like I said, I felt like that's what I was meant to do, not because I was trying to take some kind of higher road or anything of the kind. And for many years, I felt like Jekyll and Hyde. Like I felt like I had to hide away a particular part of myself to hide away language that I wanted to use. And I felt an absolute immense freedom whenever I was invited to speak in a Christian context, to just literally, I will just say it, like, let her rip, like like the undergirding of all that I teach, right, is like, we are created in the image of, right, like all of these things, right, that are at the heart and undergird all of the things that I'm trying to communicate in terms of like living alive, like we're called to more. And I think it was really in the last year and a half, I really felt at the start of COVID, really, that God was speaking to me about being more deeply rooted in the vine. And I was feeling that not specifically in him, but in the church, which is him, but just that's what it was for me, is somehow getting deeper and closer to the people of faith in my life. And so I'm just quietly, slowly trying to bring more of the language of faith into my work, kind of in the way that Brené Brown does it. I think Brené Brown does such an amazing job of being so perfectly open, right? That she is a person of faith, that church is important to her, that is a place that she goes to meet very, very, core needs. And so that's kind of the line I'm trying to walk. My work isn't going to be, it's not like now we're doing Christian digital well-being. Like, this is still the work that I'm doing, but,
right.
And it's really funny because my number one person, like, I have a very lean team, and my like core teammate is a trans woman in like Harlem, New York. And I was talking to her about doing, like, starting to talk more about my faith. And she was like, finally, she was like so excited. She was just like,
interesting.
Like, she's like hungering for more of that. She's like, I want to hear more about those things. I want to hear more about that part of you. And so for me, that was just like, yes, like that was just the yes that I needed to lean more into that. So you can keep me accountable, Joanna.
No, I think that's fascinating, because I think in a cultural context of a lot of people, I think, that's nice for you, but like, don't push it on me, is sort of, I think, how a lot of us think about, like, even just statistics and studies most recently coming out from Barna and the like around evangelism, is like, it's especially like younger generation, like, don't share your faith. Like, it's offensive or inappropriate to share your faith with other people, which is interesting when, it's kind of one of the core things about Christianity is to share it with other people. But it's this wrestle of how to do that when we've seen it done so poorly so many times. So what you're saying is there is some level of openness or curiosity to the faith that you have as part of the work that you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, anyways, we need to be whole, right? And trying to hide away certain components of our life. I think there's wisdom in that. I remember, someone I really respected one time talking to me about the verse in the Bible that talks about being wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And this was a national political leader. And he had used that approach in terms of, navigating his political career. And so I carried that with me for a long time. I think there definitely are ways in which we should be wise in terms of how we navigate that publicly. But yeah, to be innocent as doves. And for me, I read that as like, I want an innocence and a purity in my heart around who I am and what I believe. And I don't want to be hiding, let's go back to Sunday school, like hiding my light under a bushel, so to speak.
Yeah. But I think the difference too is you have done the work. I think that's the challenge for all of us, is if we would hope that people who express their faith also have thoughtful, intelligent, they've comments to add, they've contributed, maybe, I mean, in your case, you've done even like academic work on these issues. You've researched, you've talked to the right people, where I think sometimes, Christians just talk and they don't necessarily, I mean, as all people do, but Christians especially, I'm like, don't add Jesus into this, because you already clearly don't know what you're talking about.
Right. Okay. I get your point. Yeah.
Yeah. You're making us all look like a bunch of idiots. But you have done the work. I'm curious on your thoughts on, there's a classic book in my own sort of the works and readings that have impacted me. Neil Postman, Amusing Yourself to Death. I think a number of people have read it. It's fairly classic. And if people haven't read it, another shout out, another book worth reading. Can we talk about that? Do you have, can you give us, for people who don't know, tell us a little bit about that book, or just what stands out to you decades later about what he wrote a long time ago?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't do it justice by giving a synopsis, but I think the synopsis is right in the title, that the temptation always was with mass media. And of course he was writing, a number of decades ago, but he was already decades into, television, is that the fear, right, or the temptation is that we are just going to amuse ourselves to death. I remember the first time I watched The Hunger Games and saw the Capitol, and I looked at that and I was like, that's hell. And I think why I looked at that as a kind of hell was because all they had left was amusement. And it is just not the path to life. It is just not.
Wow.
We were made for more, right? A life of passive consumption is not what we were made for. We were made for more. And that is what the core of what I think Neil Postman was saying was beware, right? Beware of that. And I think when people are bringing new technologies to market, I actually had a conversation with one of the largest AI leaders, and this is already like 4.5 years ago at a tech conference, an offline tech conference. It was like a fireside conversation, and he was talking like literally like some kind of like bananas guru about how virtual reality and AI was just going to save humanity. And he was talking about putting like VR glasses on like someone in like absolute like dire poverty in Africa, and if we could just get VR to the people in Africa. And I was like, okay, but then like who's
what did he want to do? Yeah, like, why did they want that?
It was so nonsensical. Like it was just like he just believed if we could somehow all share in the same reality, that a kind of truth could pervade and we would be free or something. And this is like the kind of some of the stuff you get coming out of Silicon Valley. And I'm talking like the person who went on the first Tesla ride. Like this is someone we would all know the name of. Like, and I was the only person that challenged him and asked like, but then who's putting food on the table? Like who's feeding after that, like transformative experience,
needs, right?
Like
exactly. You need to eat before we address these issues.
100%. And it was sort of like, that's really nice, but can we bring it down like 7 levels to exactly what you just said? And so that is the fear with and that's what Neil Postman was getting at with amusing ourselves to death. Because VR comes to market, and what's the biggest uptake? Who's the first company, right, to run with VR? The porn industry, right? Of course it's the porn industry, right? Is the immersive, so that's the amusement, right? Is the first. And of course there's so many incredible things you can do in VR in terms of like building empathy and like, right, giving people a whole, as close as you can to a whole life experience. But our
you and
first
sorry, just pause. You and I, right before COVID lockdown, etc., you and I were in Edmonton, Canada together at a conference where Compassion Canada had a VR experience where you could experience life in one of the villages or towns that they work in around the world. And you could see, hear, like it was an immersive experience of what it's like for the lives of the children that they're inviting us to help and to sponsor. And so there's a great example. But if that same technology can be used for some like really, like if that's an uplifting of the child, this is like the degradation of humanity through the porn industry, etc.
Right. Yeah. And so I guess that was what Neil Postman's point was, the temptation towards a kind of amusement. And so I guess full circle, bringing us back to the conversation about how the people that are happiest with technology use it for community and creativity and care. I mean, Compassion's use of that technology was such a perfect example, right, of instilling care and growing compassion. And that is all so incredibly creative in their approach. So yeah, but I mean, Neil Postman's book is a book to return to again and again. I mean, he just saw things that
prophetic, really. I mean,
Very
it's
prophetic,
like
yeah.
an old book, but scary how true it is of 2022. Okay, so we all feel in our bones, in our guts, we know from the local news, we know that this isn't going well for us. It's not going well. I don't have children, but it's not going well for our kids. Even as a dog owner, I'm beginning to realize how aware my dog is of where my attention is, i.e. in the world or in a screen.
Yeah.
I'm seeing that she knows the difference. Like, she's in the room right now. You maybe have heard her in the
I heard
background
her.
chatting. And she's aware when I'm even on this kind of a call, and when this is over, that my attention has changed. She can sense it, and she's just an animal. So how much more is it in our heart, mind, soul, body, emotion, spirit? You're like, it's like, where do we start? Christina, please help us. This is what you do. Can we have some therapy here for a second? Because 100%. We all feel it, and then we don't know what to do. And I am looking for some help. So me and everyone listening, please help us not amuse ourselves to death.
Let's do it. Okay, so here is my very practical, contemplative Christian strategy that everyone can start today. And it is a simplified version of the Examen. So from St. Ignatius of Loyola, the Examen of conscience or consciousness. People kind of use that interchangeably. And so the simplified version that I use and I advocate for all people, and I do call it an age-old contemplative practice for those of us who do not identify as Christian. People like that. They don't like hearing, if I say the word priest, they're like, they recoil. So contemplative, but it's asking yourself at the end of the day 2 questions, and here are the 2 questions. What today was most life-giving, and what today was most life-taking? On one piece of paper, on your bedside table, write those 2 questions down, put a line down the middle, 2 columns, and just for a minute or 2 at the end of your day, just reflect back and just jot down one thing: most life-giving, most life-taking. And over time, you will likely notice that interaction, certain uses of technology are going to begin to fall into that life-taking column. And things that are very simple but are incredibly life-giving are going to start falling into your life-giving column. And over time, we begin a new orientation towards the life-giving, because of course that's what we want. We don't want more life-taking things. We don't want more despair. We want more joy. We want more of what gives life. And so that is such a simplified version. But the reality is I can give you all kinds of, like, leave your phone outside the bedroom. Like, we've all heard all of these like tech strategies, right? But the reality is that all of us have unique professional and personal demands, right? So as human beings, we're constantly changing, and the technology is changing literally by the nanosecond. And so having, like set rigorous, thou shalt and thou shalt nots around technology actually don't work super well, because it's
for most people, they don't.
Yeah, because it's a moving target. And so that's why my message is all about identifying the things that bring joy and moving towards them. And I really do believe that when you have, and I'll give this one other practical thing. When you've gone through your whole day on Zoom or on whatever platform we are on right now, when you've finished your day, right, Zooming all day, and you turn it off and you don't know what to do next, try and spend your time on a good burden. So put in the effort of putting on your shoes, getting the leash, taking your dog out, right?
She is a good little burden. That's a good analogy, actually. Yeah. Yeah.
To go, right? To care for her, to be out in nature, the burden of putting in that effort, right? Once you're across a little bit of that threshold, right? That burden disappears. You're in it. You're in the joy of it, right? A perfect example, the other day, one of my kids was home sick from school and he was kind of having a minute day and I could just feel it in my bones. Like I needed to get out of the house. And so it was a bit of a burden that we had to get across a bit of a threshold to get out the door. But at the end of the day, we often share like our, high and low of the day at dinner. And right away, it was so obvious, like my 15-minute walk in the middle of the day, right, with my kid was by far the most life-giving thing of that day. It wasn't, one more task checked off on the list. It wasn't one more social post. It wasn't even like, I'm launching a book right now. It wasn't even like all the beautiful affirmation I'm getting from people on social media. It wasn't that. It was something much more full. That was the most life-giving experience of that day.
This great quote about you, Harper's Bazaar calls you the Marie Kondo of digital, the declutterer. So, and
yes.
you have some systems and methods to this. But again, if we're starting today, I want to direct people to your website. There's all kinds of resources you have to help people. And you can be hired for whole teams, to work through this. If people are listening and lead a team. But
I will just.
Why do they call you Marie Kondo?
I mean, I guess it's sort of like, sparking joy, right? It's sparking joy in your digital life. And of course, her whole thing is, sparking joy in your home, in your space. Does it spark joy? And I mean, that is such a simplified version. I would, of course, I don't take that language because I would feel like I'm like literally stealing from Marie Kondo and I would never do that. But it's a great question. Are the people you're following on social media sparking joy? Are your habits sparking? Are your digital habits sparking joy? Are the newsletters that you're still getting in your inbox that you think aren't really taking any of your time and attention, but they are at the periphery? They're still taking like a tiny bit of your margin. Are those sparking joy? Should those still be there? Or do they need to go? And so that is where that quote comes from. But very practically, if you do go to my website at christinacrook.com, there is a free JOMO guide there. And that JOMO guide has my digital house
JOMO
cleaning.
As in joy of missing out.
JOMO as in the joy.
People aren't catching up yet. Joy of missing out.
Thank you very much. The JOMO guide, the joy of missing out. But it's a digital house cleaning guide. I have a program and we have a monthly live call where we do a live digital house cleaning. So you do it, you get it done, you clean house. But you mean
like you're on you're bringing your phone and you're like deleting apps on the call? Is that 100%? 100%. Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
You're deleting apps, you're organizing your apps, you are unfollowing in your newsletter subscribes and your email, you're unfollowing people on social media. So I've giving you guys for free my process and that free guide, but would also obviously love to have you in the program as well. But yeah, that's why I'm called the Marie Kondo of digital. I kind of I'm a bit sheepish about it, but I'm also proud.
I think it's a good. I don't be sheepish because I actually think we're always looking like, it's the Airbnb for
that's right.
For cars. It's the Airbnb for pets or
swimming pools
for comparative for swimming pools. Yeah, we're trying to make those comparisons. So like people understand that Marie Kondo. She declutters.
That's right.
So maybe one of my last questions for you is around this idea of joy. Joy is the joy of missing out, but joy is a signature piece of your philosophy around digital, and I don't hear a lot of people using that language. So in some ways, maybe it's just that it's Christian language, because joy is, from the Lord.
Indeed.
But why joy? And is this really possible? I'm a skeptic about the joy factor. So do you have joy about your digital stuff? Tell me about this.
Yeah. Okay. So this was super helpful. So after my book came out, probably already the first book, The Joy of Missing Out, I was doing a word study, as I do sometimes, because that's probably something that you and I both geek out on as well as digital. And I did a word study on joy. And it was so simple. It was written right into the Merriam-Webster's dictionary definition of the word joy are these two words: well-being and success. Wellness and success. And so how I define joy is the combination of well-being and success, but one layer deeper. Here's how I define well-being and success. Well-being is having a positive relationship with your abilities and your limits. And success is just the achievement of your goals. So those are totally possible in our digital lives. It is possible to have a positive relationship with your abilities and your limits. Christina Crook, a bit messy, sometimes attracted to shiny objects, loves public speaking, but hates it too. Like the whole mess of like who I am, right? My abilities and my limits. And being candid about that as best as I can on digital, right? Like not trying to like be a perfectly like I'm both, right? Both and then the achievement of my goals. I can feel really good. I can experience joy. You can experience joy online when you're using it to achieve your goals, when you're actually accomplishing your goals. So is it possible? 100%. Yes.
Okay, Christina. Okay, you're giving me some hopefulness. I think because as we come year 2 of COVID and there's a weariness as we're into another winter season, at least where we are in the Northern Hemisphere, the very northern Toronto. There is a weariness we feel. And there's a lot of doom and gloom. I mean, if this season of the podcast had a theme, this sort of subtle theme is really like the world is on fire. What do we do now? That seems to be what I want to talk about the most with my guests. And it does feel like the world is on fire. And so to hear you say that joy on the internet is attainable, because I think one of the wrestles is that the addiction of the internet to me is like a food addiction, because at the end of the day, we actually need some of it. But how do we have a healthier relationship with it? Whereas opposed to like you're addicted to cocaine, let's stop having you use cocaine. Yeah. Like you can remove it completely from your life. But I think most of us aren't going to become modern Amish people where like, again, like they looked at technology and said like, we will fundamentally say no. We're going to ask interesting questions about, does this help us? If not, we're not going to add it. And, it's why they don't have cars, because they felt like it was separating people from connectedness. It sped up life too much, etc. I don't know why they wear the funny hats, but I don't know what that's got to do with it. But all to say, most of us aren't going to go in that direction. It feels more like a food addiction, where like we need this to live. We need it for our professional lives, for connection to our loved ones. So how do we get a healthier relationship to it? So I'm grateful that you're doing this work. It is. Maybe the work itself, I hope it feels to you like a good burden for us all. I appreciate your research and your work. If people want to find more about you, where do you want to send them?
ChristinaCrook.com. ChristinaCrook.com. Yeah.
And what about the book? They can get the book all over the place.
Yeah. You can get the book in all the good places where books can be sold. Go to Amazon last. Call your local bookstore.
I'm on your email list. Yeah. And you said specifically, this was a, for people who don't know how bookstores work. If you go, can you tell us, like, if you go to your local bookstore, your independent shop, what can they do to get them to get the book or other books that they want?
Oh yeah. So, I mean, just Google bookstore. If you don't know the closest bookstore to your house, that's goal number 1. Find the closest bookstore to your house. Number 2, phone them and just tell them the books that you want. You're automatically supporting an author who's going to make more money from that purchase. And then you're also supporting your local bookstore, which gives life to your neighborhood, right? The good burden of walking to your bookstore and having them recommend a book. It is such a treasure. But I mean, of course, you can also get the book in all the convenient ways that I'm sure you're used to.
Yes. Christina, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.